In the quiet, mist-laden town of Willow's Edge, there's a road that everyone knows but no one talks about. This narrow, winding path, cutting straight through the heart of the dense forest, is known simply as the road. To travelers passing through, it seems unremarkable at first. Just a lonely stretch between vast fields and old woods, broken only by the occasional glint of worn road signs. But the townsfolk know better. Locals have lived by an unspoken rule for generations. Never stop on the road, never pick up strangers, and above all, never drive it after dark. Strangers who ignore these rules often don't return, and if they do, they're never the same again. For years, stories about the road have circulated as warnings, whispered from parent to child, from neighbor to neighbor. Most town residents adhere to this code strictly, refusing to speak openly of it, but each person holds on to their own haunting memory. A brother who disappeared one night, a friend who returned shaken and haunted, unwilling to share what they'd seen. As years passed, only a handful dared to investigate the phenomenon, but those brave or foolish enough to try were seldom heard from again. This dark history of disappearances and strange tales soon became the foundation of the town's unwritten law. When newcomers asked why there was no patrol on the road or why everyone seemed to avoid it, townsfolk offered vague explanations. There's no need, or simply, it's not a safe place. Enter Chris Lang, a freelance journalist drawn to Willow's Edge by these very rumors. Chris was known for taking on stories that no one else would, and for them, this strange, almost mythical road presented a mystery too tantalizing to ignore. They had come to Willow's Edge with high hopes, eager to investigate the disappearances and strange sightings that had plagued the town for decades. Within days, Chris was gathering local stories, piecing together fragments of fear and warnings from locals reluctant to speak openly. Many advised Chris to drop the matter altogether, warning them in hushed tones about the roadkeeper, a sinister figure who, as rumor had it, was responsible for anyone who dared to stop on that cursed stretch. But Chris was determined. Each fragment of the story only fueled their curiosity further, and before long, they had mapped out a detailed plan for investigating the road themselves. Despite the increasing weight of warnings, Chris ventured out on a foggy autumn evening, armed with a flashlight, a camera, and a recorder to document anything unusual. As dusk settled and the first hint of moonlight shimmered through the trees, they found themselves alone on the road, surrounded by a silence so complete it seemed to hum. Chris couldn't help but feel that the forest was watching, the tall, dark trees looming like silent sentinels, casting shadows that danced in the dim light. Every now and then, they heard the faint rustle of leaves or the snap of a twig, sounds that felt more alive than they should in the stillness. As Chris drove slowly, nerves tight with anticipation, they passed a series of strange symbols carved into the roadside trees, barely visible in the moonlight. The markings looked ancient and complex, blending into the bark almost as if they were part of the trees themselves. They stopped briefly, snapping photos and recording notes, when a sudden chill filled the air. A cold mist crept up from the ground, enveloping the car and seeping into the very frame, thick enough to make visibility nearly impossible. Fighting their growing sense of dread, Chris took a shaky breath and pressed on, determined to find the source of these mysterious stories. The farther they traveled, the stronger the oppressive silence became, as though the road itself was absorbing every sound. Even the soft hum of the car seemed muted, swallowed by the dark, still air. Then, without warning, Chris spotted something lying in the road ahead. Heart pounding, they slowed to a stop and, against all better judgment, stepped out to investigate. On the ground lay an old leather bag, scuffed and weathered, and a single faded shoe beside it. It was the first tangible sign of those who had gone missing, a haunting reminder of the countless others who had dared to stop on this very road. Chris knelt down to examine the items, snapping photos and muttering observations into the recorder, when they noticed more items scattered just beyond the roadside. These were objects long abandoned, an old camera, a crumpled map, and even a broken watch, all lost relics of people who had once passed through. It was as if these items had been left as breadcrumbs, a silent warning to anyone who might venture too far. Then they heard it, a faint sound from deeper in the woods, a rhythmic tapping like something metal hitting a tree. The sound grew louder, echoing through the trees, accompanied by a strange flickering light that danced through the mist. Chris's breath caught in their throat, but something stronger than fear kept them rooted to the spot. As the tapping grew closer, a figure emerged from the shadows. They were tall and cloaked, their face hidden under a hood that seemed to blend into the darkness. Chris knew instantly who this was, the Roadkeeper, the mysterious figure at the heart of Willow's Edge's dark legend. Paralyzed by fear and fascination, Chris watched as the figure raised an arm, gesturing in a slow, deliberate motion as if inviting them to follow. An overwhelming compulsion washed over Chris. Despite every instinct screaming at them to run, they felt pulled toward the figure as if under a spell. With each step into the forest, Chris felt time slip away. Hours seemed to pass in a blur as they followed the Roadkeeper deeper into the trees, the light growing dimmer, the air colder with each passing moment. It was as if the very fabric of reality was twisting, reshaping itself around them. Finally, they arrived at a clearing, illuminated by a sickly green light emanating from a massive, intricately carved stone in the center. The symbols on the stone matched those they'd seen on the trees, only these glowed faintly, pulsing with an unnatural energy. The Roadkeeper turned to face Chris, a bony hand pointing at the stone. In a voice that seemed to echo from a distant, hollow place, they spoke. "Those who trespass on my road must pay the toll." Suddenly, Chris realized the horrifying truth. This was no ordinary road, and the Roadkeeper was no ordinary man. They were the gatekeeper of a place beyond this world, a realm where the souls of those who defied the road's rules were trapped. Chris could see them now, faint, ghostly shapes hovering around the stone, their eyes empty, their expressions frozen in fear. These were the missing travelers, cursed to wander this desolate place for all eternity. Chris felt their heart pound as they struggled to break free from the Roadkeeper's gaze, but the pull was too strong. Desperation surged within them as they remembered the symbols they had recorded, symbols that might hold the key to breaking the curse. With trembling hands, Chris fumbled for their camera, hastily reviewing the photos they'd taken, hoping for some clue, some way to sever the bond that held them in this nightmare. They traced the symbols, muttering the names of places and markings they'd seen, piecing together the fragmented images of past victims who had left behind clues in their final moments. Then, in a moment of clarity, they saw it, a small, nearly invisible marking etched into the edge of the stone, a symbol unlike any other they had seen. They reached out, hands shaking, and traced the marking, feeling a jolt of energy surge through them. In that instant, the air around them seemed to shatter, and the ghostly figures around the stone began to dissolve, their forms lifting like mist in the morning sun. The Roadkeeper let out a furious, inhuman shriek, their cloaked form disintegrating into shadows as the curse was broken. Chris stumbled back, gasping for breath, their surroundings slowly returning to normal as dawn's light began to filter through the trees. The road was empty, silent once more, but now it felt free of its oppressive weight. Exhausted and shaken, Chris made their way back to town, the horrors they'd witnessed still fresh in their mind. But as they recounted their tale to the townsfolk, a strange realization dawned. They looked at Chris with blank expressions, their faces void of any recognition or memory of the Roadkeeper or the curse. It was as though the road's dark history had been erased, leaving Chris as the only one who remembered. Back in their car, Chris glanced at the road one last time before leaving Willow's Edge behind, knowing the truth of what lay beyond that quiet town, hidden in the mist and shadows. They had freed themselves and the lost souls from the Roadkeeper's grip, but the memory of the haunting ordeal would stay with them forever, a chilling reminder of what happens to those who defy the road and the dark powers that lay hidden, waiting for the next unwitting traveler to stop and linger too long on that cursed path. The weeks following Chris's return from Willow's Edge were a blur of sleepless nights and vivid nightmares. Even in the safety of their own apartment, the haunting memories of that night on the road clung to them like a shadow, always present, never fully fading. Despite having broken the curse, Chris couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them back. They would often wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, feeling the ghostly presence of the Roadkeeper lurking just out of sight. Desperate to understand what they had experienced, Chris spent every free moment researching. They pored over myths, folklore, and ancient tales from cultures worldwide, looking for anything that resembled the roadkeeper or the curse they'd encountered. But the more they searched, the stranger things began to happen. Their electronics would glitch whenever they looked up the town or related folklore. Friends they spoke to about Willow's Edge would start losing interest or dismiss the story as if an invisible force compelled them to forget. It was as though the memory of the roadkeeper still held power, as if it didn't want to be remembered. One evening, as Chris was reviewing their footage, they noticed something chilling. The video they'd taken of the carved symbols showed faint, shifting shadows that hadn't been there in real life. They played the video on repeat, feeling their stomach twist in fear as the shadows began to form shapes, ghostly outlines of people trapped in the mist. One figure, tall and cloaked, remained distinct among the rest, watching Chris through the lens as if aware of being observed. Driven by a mixture of terror and obsession, Chris decided to return to Willow's Edge to understand the curse once and for all. They had no plan, no solid idea of what they hoped to find, but a voice inside them, a soft, insistent whisper they couldn't ignore, urged them back to the source. They packed a bag with the essentials: a flashlight, extra batteries, a notebook, and a single worn photo of the road. The road in the image seemed different now, as if the very paper held the weight of what Chris had seen and done there. Chris arrived in Willow's Edge under the cover of darkness, the small town shrouded in a dense, unnatural fog. To their surprise, the townsfolk seemed changed. People who had once been warm and welcoming now turned away at the sight of Chris, avoiding eye contact as they muttered amongst themselves. It was as if they sensed Chris's connection to the road and wanted no part of it. A familiar figure approached, Mary, a local innkeeper who had shared some of the initial stories with Chris. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and anger. "You shouldn't have come back," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "By breaking the curse, you didn't free us. You only angered it. The roadkeeper is restless now, and it's no longer just the road he haunts. You opened something, Chris. Something that should have remained closed." Chris felt a shiver run down their spine as Mary explained. In breaking the curse, Chris had disrupted a centuries-old balance. Now the roadkeeper was free to roam beyond the forest and had begun haunting the dreams of the townspeople, drawing them back to the road at night, where they wandered in a trance, leaving offerings of personal items to appease the restless spirit. Chris realized with a sickening feeling that the curse had not been broken. It had only evolved, shifting its reach and power. Determined to make things right, Chris resolved to return to the clearing where they had last confronted the roadkeeper. They set out on foot through the thick forest, guided only by the dim light of the moon and the fading memory of the path. The silence was as suffocating as before, but now it held a new quality, a tense anticipation that felt alive and malevolent. Chris could feel eyes watching from the darkness, shadows moving at the edges of their vision, but they pressed on, driven by a mixture of fear and guilt.